Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, the headlines recently have brought to mind one of our previous episodes, the one that we did on wildfires, because of course you in New York are being blanketed by the same smoke that has afflicted us here in the Pacific Northwest the past 2 or 3 years running. So how has it been? Do you feel like the air quality is hazardous to your health?
Well, it isn't hazardous today, and in truth, it was just a few days last week when it got really bad. But it was so bad, Mark. It was really creepy.
Yeah.
I think New York's on the air pollution index hit an all-time high and was the single most polluted place on Earth last Wednesday.
Right, yeah.
And it was just an orange, smoggy blanket right at ground level. So, I was smelling smoke that smelled like there was a fire across the street when the fire was in Nova Scotia and Alberta. So it's kind of unbelievable to live through something like that. But I certainly understand what you guys went through now with a much more visceral sense.
Yeah. I can tell you that was kind of the experience for us in the Northwest to read these breathless headlines from East Coast journalists like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. How could we be experiencing this? And we were like, yeah, we know exactly how you feel. That's how we were.
Yeah.
I know what it's like to walk outside and for the air to smell like a campfire. I also, on some of the worst days, I felt like I could taste the air. I don't know if it got that bad over there.
Yeah, on that one day it did. But now that, the question is, what are we going to do about it now? And we'll see what kind of resolve this nation has to actually admit the truth of climate change and then start doing something about it.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe a future episode on that right there.
Yeah.
So while we're talking about things that we seem to never do anything about, that brings us to this week's topic.
Good segue.
Yes, I'm the king of segues on this podcast.
Yes.
So if you've been paying attention to the news, you have seen that we as a nation just passed through something that we seem to do every couple of years, which is flirt with the debt ceiling, where we play this game of national chicken, where is Congress going to be able to send a bill to the president to sign to avert the catastrophe that will result if we fail to raise the debt ceiling and consequently default on the national debt. And it struck me as we were going through this most recent time that I often hear people say, oh, it would be a horrible thing if that were to happen, but no one ever says specifically what it would be. And so, sometimes you just want to bite down on that sore tooth and feel the pain more specifically. So that's why I sent you down this rabbit hole, Joe, to tell us specifically what would happen if we were to default on the national debt and how would that show up in our lives. So what did you find?
Yeah, so I am going to answer that question, but I just have to say, when you said flirting with the debt ceiling, I got some strange image of swiping right on Tinder for the debt ceiling, which I think is something Republicans probably would actually want to do.
Yeah, or at least fantasize about it.
Yeah, but thanks for the question, as always. This is a really timely issue, given what happened in Washington earlier this month. As you mentioned in your question when you teed it up for me last time, President Biden and House Speaker McCarthy reached an agreement on the debt ceiling a couple of weeks ago that made almost nobody happy, but it averted a crisis, or at least it kicked the crisis can down the road a couple of years.
Yeah.
Let me say up front that I agree with the premise of your question, that if we tempt fate by careening toward a debt ceiling showdown every year or two, especially when one half of the negotiation is controlled by nihilists from today's Republican Party, it does seem inevitable that we will eventually default on the debt and bring on the crisis that everyone warns about.
Sure. Yeah, just a matter of time.
Right. So here's how I'd like to proceed. First, I'm going to explain in layman's terms what the debt ceiling is, how it came to be, and how it got so unmanageable. Then I'll talk about what would happen if we breached it, which is your central question. And finally, I'll say a few words about how we can avoid detonating this time bomb in the future if we want to. And those last 4 words, if we want to, are key.
Mm-hmm.
The debt ceiling, also known as the debt limit, is a cap on the total amount of money the United States government is authorized to borrow in order to meet its financial obligations. Our country usually runs budget deficits, meaning that it spends more than it takes in through taxes and other revenue, and it has to borrow lots of money to pay its bills. Incidentally, the only budget surpluses in recent history came from 1998 to 2001 at the end of Bill Clinton's second term.
Yeah.
Among the many bills that must be paid by the federal government are funding for safety net programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps, interest on the national debt, and salaries for troops and other federal employees. Any change to the debt ceiling requires the approval of both chambers of Congress. While the periodic debates about raising the debt ceiling always include calls by politicians to cut back on federal spending, the act of lifting the debt ceiling in and of itself does not authorize any new spending. All it does is to allow the U.S. to finance its existing obligations. That last point is crucial, so I want to say it again because I think a lot of people in this country don't understand this. The single most important thing to know about the debt ceiling, and what makes it ultimately so silly in my view, is that it's not a limit on future spending. It's a limit on the U.S. Treasury Department's ability to borrow money to repay debts it already owes for prior spending approved by Congress.
Right. In effect, it's certain regions within Congress deciding that they don't want to pay for things that they've already bought.
Yeah, right. Let's just pause for a second and think about that. I'm going to use a grossly oversimplified hypothetical, but something we can all relate to. Imagine that you and your wife went to the supermarket last week to buy groceries. The two of you authorize the spending for your grocery run by mutually agreeing to use a credit card to cover the bill. Because you pay your credit card bills on time, never missing a payment in all the time you've been together, your credit is highly rated by credit agencies, and your credit limit has increased over the years. So, you brought the groceries home, you've been consuming them ever since. Now it's a week later, and the two of you are forced by law to sign an agreement reauthorizing the money you already spent last week. That's a silly nuisance, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, but to make this more realistic, let's say that your wife, who's playing the role of congressional Republicans in this hypothetical, decides that she no longer thinks you should pay for those half-eaten eggs and bagels that you've been eating for the past week. So she refuses to sign the reauthorization unless you, Mark, agree to get a cheaper cell phone data plan, work more hours per week, and cap your spending on underwear and socks.
Right.
Now, you're willing to talk about budget cuts for future spending and how you might be able to offset those cuts by bringing in more money, but you're not willing to renege on the obligation to pay the credit card bill. But your wife refuses to budge unless you accede to her demands right now. Oh, and if you don't both sign the reauthorization immediately, your credit rating will be irrevocably damaged, which will lead to a cascading series of financial problems for your household. Welcome to the debt ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Constitution states that the legislative branch, Congress, must authorize all borrowing. In theory, a debt ceiling can be useful by making it unnecessary for the U.S. Treasury to ask for permission every time it needs to issue bonds to pay the nation's bills, which was basically the way it worked for the first 125 years of our nation's history. The origin of the U.S. debt ceiling goes back to America's entry into World War I in 1917, when then-President Woodrow Wilson lobbied Congress to authorize increased borrowing to support the war effort. Congress dutifully passed the Second Liberty Bond Act. which established a limit of $11.5 billion on war-related spending, with any further increase subject to congressional approval. That $11.5 billion was the first debt ceiling. In 1939, an overall aggregated limit of $45 billion was placed on federal debt. It quickly rose to $300 billion by the end of World War II, then pretty much stayed flat until the 1960s. Mark, do you know how much it is today?
No clue. I'm expecting it to be big.
Yeah. So after the last round of negotiations, both sides agreed to suspend the debt ceiling at $31.4 trillion, with the next reauthorization pushed back to January 2025. The debt ceiling matters because if it isn't increased, the United States can potentially default on its obligations. In the 106 years since the debt ceiling was established, it's been raised or suspended by Congress dozens of times, and until relatively recently, those actions were entirely non-controversial, sometimes even unanimously decided. Interestingly, the U.S. has technically defaulted on its debt before, but never because of the debt ceiling. One time was in 1814 when the financial strain of the War of 1812 led to late interest payments. It also happened briefly in 1979 due to a computer glitch in the check writing equipment, though the U.S. Treasury doesn't consider that one to be a true default. The debt ceiling really didn't become contentious until the last 30 years or so. That so many debt ceiling negotiations become showdowns these days is a choice made by politicians to preserve their own power and leverage, which they invariably use to influence policies not related to debt or deficits, like the permitting of that energy pipeline that Senator Joe Manchin just got in this year's debt ceiling deal.
Yeah, they see it as an opportunity, considering that they hold sway over something that everybody wants to avoid. They can use the threat as a way of extracting favors that otherwise they wouldn't get.
Yes, true. But at what potential cost? I mean, that's what we're going to talk about now. We learned from recent debt crises that even coming close to a default without actually defaulting has consequences. In 2011, a tense standoff between President Obama and congressional Republicans who wanted to defund the Affordable Care Act didn't get resolved until 2 days before the date the Treasury said it would run out of money, and the credit rating agency Standard & Poor's downgraded the United States credit rating for the first and only time ever, which disrupted bond yields and roiled the stock market, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average falling by 2,000 points in less than 2 months. It also raised the government's borrowing costs by about $19 billion over the next decade. In 1995, 2013, and 2018, even though a default was averted each time, the heightened rhetoric of the debate over the debt ceiling forced the government into brief shutdowns ranging from 16 to 35 days. And just last month, amid the most recent debt ceiling tensions, interest rates on the safest of safe investments, 4-week U.S. Treasury bills, reached record highs. It's easy to be cynical when politicians of both parties engage in performative demonstrations of fiscal responsibility, given both parties' propensity to increase the deficit whenever they are in power, either by cutting taxes, which is the Republicans' go-to move, or increasing spending, the Democrats' go-to move. The national debt has increased by $25 trillion since the start of this century and has tripled since 2009. And both parties share the blame for that. But if you're trying to make the both sides argument that Democrats and Republicans are equally responsible for bringing us to the brink of fiscal calamity by playing chicken with the debt ceiling, that's just not borne out by recent history. It's true that the debt ceiling was raised during the administrations of both Republican and Democratic presidents in the last couple of decades, but the devil is in the details. In 2006, when George W. Bush was president, Senate Democrats, including then-Senator Joe Biden, voted against a debt limit increase. But Democrats didn't filibuster that vote, and the Republican majority was able to increase the debt limit along party lines. The Biden White House described his 2006 vote as symbolic, knowing in advance that it wouldn't sink the economy. More recently, Democrats helped President Trump, a man they universally despise, to increase borrowing 3 times during his presidency without ever threatening default. Whereas, the same Republicans who ran up trillions in new debt to pay for Trump's 2017 tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires routinely force the country to the precipice of default whenever there's a Democrat in the White House, shamelessly pretending to care about the debt and deficits that they ignored when their guys were in office.
Mm-hmm.
The word brinkmanship is often used in connection with debt ceiling negotiations. It means, quote, the art or practice of pushing a dangerous situation or confrontation to the limit of safety, especially to force a desired outcome, end quote. That's an accurate description of the actions of congressional Republicans. Their commitment to the facade of fiscal prudence is downright laughable when you consider that in this latest debt ceiling brouhaha, they wanted to cut only non-defense discretionary spending, which amounts to less than 1/8 of the money the U.S. government spends annually. They didn't have the guts to propose cuts to military spending or entitlements enjoyed by their voters like Medicare and Social Security, the costs of which are going to balloon over the next 10 years when people like you and me qualify for benefits. They also rejected the idea of raising taxes on corporations and high earners, which would have generated billions in revenue that could have been earmarked to balancing the budget. In short, their actions reek of bad faith.
Yeah, I think if there's anything that we've been trained to expect recently, it's that politicians will play politics. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of good faith bargaining going on in Washington. It's more playing for the cameras and setting yourself up for guest appearances on Fox News.
Yeah, that's true, but I'm arguing here that there's a particular brand of, I would call nihilist politics that's being played by Republicans that distinguishes them from Democrats when it comes to these semi-annual debt ceiling crises. We don't have to have perpetual debt ceiling drama. That's one of the ironies here. The USA is one of the few nations in the world that even has a debt ceiling. Australia introduced one in 2007, but promptly repealed it in 2013. Poland's constitution caps spending at 60% of GDP, but doesn't impose limits on borrowing. The only Western country that currently has a debt ceiling, other than us, is Denmark. But its ceiling is much higher relative to the spending, so it's never been in serious danger of being breached. Denmark is actually a good illustration of what sane, sober political leadership looks like to ward off such self-imposed catastrophe. The closest Denmark ever came to breaching its debt ceiling was in 2010 during the Great Recession, when its debt approached 75% of the limit. Danish politicians promptly doubled the ceiling. By contrast, we come perilously close to breaching our debt limit every few years. So who's the idiot here? A solution to perennial debt ceiling standoffs once existed. In 1979, the House adopted the Gephardt Rule. Named after its original sponsor, Congressman Richard Gephardt, it was a parliamentary rule that deemed the debt ceiling to be automatically raised whenever a budget resolution was passed, which resolved the contradiction of Congress voting for appropriations but not voting to fund them. In a speech on the House floor, Representative Gephardt stated that his rule, quote, puts the consideration of the appropriate level for the debt ceiling where it legitimately and logically belongs. That is, in the context of when we vote for the spending that creates the need to change the debt ceiling, end quote.
Right.
Alas, this eminently sensible rule was repealed by the Newt Gingrich-led Republicans after their takeover of Congress in 1995. That's really when the debt ceiling began to be used not as a tool, but as a weapon.
Have you ever noticed how many of the really carcinogenic elements of our modern political landscape can be traced back to Newt Gingrich? It's really remarkable how often his name comes up considering how long he's been out of power.
Yes, I have noticed that. And I think books have been written about how he just instilled an entirely different climate for congressional negotiations that were founded in hatred and distrust instead of collegiality. And it really has had spillover effects and arguably created Trump.
Yeah, I've always felt the core of Newt Gingrich's way of thinking and his way of playing politics was to absolutely demonize the opponents.
Yes.
Where they're not people who disagree with you. They are fundamentally bad,
yes,
wrong, un-American, and evil, to the point where standing up for them and opposing what the other side believes in can be represented as a patriotic act instead of just an act of obstructionism. And I feel like it's that mindset that continues to dog us to this day, where there is no middle in Congress.
Yes.
Because so much of the representatives were elected on the promise to never cooperate, never give any ground, never allow the other side to win.
Yes.
Instead of thinking what's good for the country, it's about just simply defeating the other side.
Yeah, well put. I totally agree. I think the Gingrich point of view has infected the rank and file in his own party, and now it's seeped into the voter population. And it's out of control now, and it's why we're talking about this today. All right, this year, we reached the debt ceiling on January 19th, and with no deal in sight at that time, the Treasury Department reinstituted its policy of taking quote-unquote extraordinary measures to delay a debt default by several months, using fiscal accounting tools like selling off assets, underinvesting in some government funds, and delaying payments to the retirement accounts of federal employees. At some point, those measures become insufficient to stave off default, which is why we heard so much from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen last month about an early June deadline for the most recent debt ceiling negotiations. That brings me to your central question. What would happen if the once unthinkable prospect of a U.S. debt default actually took place? First, the credit rating of the United States of America, which is the linchpin of the world's financial system, would be downgraded significantly. As a result, the interest rates that our government pays on its bonds, which have historically been super low to reflect their status as the safest investment vehicle in the world, would rise sharply. This would almost surely cause a spike in interest rates for all domestic and foreign banks, which would increase borrowing costs for businesses and for homeowners to the tune of $130,000 on an average 30-year mortgage by one estimate. So that's serious money.
Yeah. That
would in turn lead to a sharp reduction in consumer confidence, quantified by economists at Goldman Sachs as the near immediate cessation of about 1/10 of U.S. economic activity. The centrist think tank Third Way estimates that 3 million Americans would lose their jobs within a few weeks of a default. The Dow Jones would likely plunge by hundreds or even thousands of points per day, taking millions of Americans' retirement accounts down with it. The impact of these rapid-fire blows to the economy would almost surely trigger a deep recession. We've seen the horrific effects of recessions on people's economic prospects, but the federal government would also feel the pain. Those higher interest rates would not only increase the national debt by $850 billion, but would also inevitably divert federal money away from critical investments in healthcare, climate, infrastructure, and education, as if we needed any more excuses for delaying our action on those fronts.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure the defense budget would be safe, though.
Yeah, knowing Congress, yes. Meanwhile, a debt default and recession in the USA would wreak havoc on global financial markets. There's a reason why the US dollar is considered to be the world's reserve currency, with 58% of the world's foreign currency reserves currently held in dollars. It's because of the creditworthiness of U.S. Treasury securities. A hit to that creditworthiness would cause investors to sell Treasury bonds, which would weaken the dollar. A weakened dollar devalues all those currency reserves, which makes it harder for low-income countries with significant debt to make interest payments on their debt, which could tip those nations into recession or, even worse, political or humanitarian crisis. I'm going to give you an example. Let's consider a country like Sri Lanka, which is beset by high inflation and a drop in its local currency such that shippers recently refused to release containers of desperately needed food unless they were paid in US dollars. With its cash reserves consisting of suddenly weakened dollars, Sri Lanka might not be able to feed its people. Instability in the dollar would also benefit China, which has long aspired to position its currency, the yuan, as a reserve currency, though it accounts for only 3% of global reserves right now, compared to the US 58%. On that last point, Marcus Noland of the Peterson Institute for International Economics wrote, quote, "For a Congress that is obsessed with America's standing vis-a-vis China, the notion that it would commit an own goal and hand China such an opportunity seems incomprehensible." End quote. A debt default also means that whenever revenue became available, our government would be forced into a Sophie's choice between paying federal bondholders and honoring its obligation to fund critical entitlements like Social Security and Medicare, not to mention paying the salaries of the millions of Americans in the military and in federal government jobs ranging from mail carriers to regulators to park rangers to federal prosecutors. The Treasury would surely prioritize bondholders because any additional delay in making interest payments on Treasury-backed securities further jeopardizes our financial standing. So there's no doubt the federal workforce and entitlement beneficiaries, which, let's face it, comprises most Americans, would suffer right from the start.
Yeah.
If the default persisted for any length of time, say beyond a few weeks, the federal government would have to impose across-the-board spending freezes on virtually everything, or huge tax increases, or both, just to tread water. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's, and his colleagues ran the numbers on a protracted default and found that 7.8 million jobs would disappear. The unemployment rate would jump from the current 3.7% to over 8%, and a plunge in the stock market would erase $10 trillion in household wealth. So, to address one of your questions from last time, Mark, dogs and cats might not get married and live together in unholy union, but dogs might start eating cats when their owners can't afford to feed them anymore.
Yeah, if they're not eating the owners.
Yes. If my recitation of all those dire consequences didn't convince you that the debt ceiling is a dangerously stupid idea, maybe this will. In 2013, our alma mater, the University of Chicago, did a poll of U.S. economic experts across the ideological spectrum. 97% agreed that, quote, "a separate debt ceiling that has to be increased periodically creates unneeded uncertainty and can potentially lead to worse fiscal outcomes," end quote, which is basically the theory underpinning your question.
Mm-hmm.
The eminent Chicago economist and Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler wrote, quote, "The debt ceiling is a dumb idea with no benefits and potentially catastrophic costs," end quote. Roger Ferguson of the Council on Foreign Relations added that, quote, "It is time for the United States to leave behind this antiquated mechanism that brings the country to the precipice of default every few years," end quote. So that's the expert opinion about the effect of a debt default on America writ large. But I think the best way to process your question, Mark, is at the micro level. If a debt default were really to happen, the United States government would be cast into the role of the everyday American, struggling to pay his or her bills when income falls short of expenses. Maybe one month you're late on the rent. Maybe the next month you don't pay your utility bill. Maybe you cut your food budget, or you miss a car payment, or you hock some of your valuables. Maybe you miss work to take care of the kids because you can't afford daycare anymore. Each accommodation eats away at your confidence and self-esteem. Each indignity adversely affects your reputation in the community. From the bird's eye view, it may not seem like a big deal, but if you're on the ground living that reality, as many millions of Americans would be, should our leaders be careless and cruel enough to default on our sovereign debt, it sure would feel like Armageddon.
That's a chilling forecast, Joe, considering that we've already said on this podcast that it's probably only a matter of time if we keep playing chicken over and over again for that to happen. So really, it's not a question of if that will happen. It would be a question of when, unless the political landscape changes dramatically.
Right.
And so far, I haven't seen any indication that the landscape is going to change radically in the near term.
Right. And just to contemplate that there are people in Congress who want this to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, that itself is mind-boggling. Either they're total idiots to not understand what I just explained, or they're such nihilists that they'd rather burn the country down. Either way, it's just damning.
Yeah, I think there's an element of nihilism there, though it probably comes in different flavors. You've got the religious nihilism that posits that America is a godless country and that there needs to be fire before there's salvation. And you can find churches today that if you go in there on a Sunday, you will hear the minister preaching something along those lines. I don't know how well represented that is in Congress, but there are probably some members who have that. And then there are the members of Congress who were basically elected on the platform of shutting down federal programs. And they always target the people they don't like, right? So it's shutting down immigration, shutting down social programs, shutting down things that benefit the poor, shutting down education for people who look different from their constituents.
Right. Food stamps. Exactly.
And there are elements of the federal government that they believe in that they still support, like, for instance, defense and corn subsidies. But I feel like for some, it's a bargain that they'd be willing to make to screw the whole thing as long as they can take out the things that they hate and that they were elected to eliminate. So you do kind of have this scenario where the fate of the nation depends on a good faith bargain being struck between two sides, and yet the two sides do not agree on the desirability of the bargain being reached.
Right.
So yeah, that's where I think the brinksmanship comes from, is that one side in this debate just sees it as much lower stakes than the other side because they're kind of okay with the idea of burning it all down.
Right.
Because they look around at a country that is well on its way to a minority majority and to urban centers having population where they can just overcome the votes from the rural districts, and a post-Christian society, again, a former episode of this podcast, and they see this as not their country anymore. So they're willing to burn it down in order to get a chance to build it back up in the shape of something that they see as more desirable.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just accurately summarized that side's point of view, but I just keep coming back to how founded in ignorance it is, because if we default, one of the things that's going to miraculously disappear is the Social Security check or the Medicare benefit that those people who are disproportionately old and disproportionately unhealthy rely on to live. That's going to go away. They don't seem to understand that, but that's just the truth.
Yeah.
Okay, one last thing before we go, Mark. In my reading, I came across 3 basic strategies for bypassing the debt ceiling. The first requires congressional approval, while the other 2 don't. Number 1, we can eliminate the debt ceiling altogether or raise it stratospherically high, or at least reinstate the Gephardt rule to make it increase automatically whenever Congress passes a spending bill. Any of these would be the most logical and straightforward approach. But as I just mentioned, they all require an act of Congress, which ain't going to happen anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
Remember I said at the top that reform like this will happen only if we want it to? Well, the nihilist caucus in the Republican Party, as we just said at length, doesn't want it to. And they are ascendant right now, unfortunately, for the rest of us. Number 2, we can decide that the debt ceiling is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment states that, quote, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Some legal analysts believe that provides the president with the authority to ignore the statutory debt limit and issue more debt. Bill Clinton said he would have done that if Republicans refused to lift the debt ceiling when he was in office, but the Obama administration's lawyers disagreed.
I don't know the process, but is this something where someone could bring a lawsuit that challenges the constitutionality of the debt ceiling and eventually gets to the Supreme Court?
Yeah.
Because this is, in fact, a Supreme Court with a strong conservative majority, but they also state that they are constitutional literalists. So by their own principles, they should, in fact, rule that exactly what the Constitution says is what should be enforced. And so it seems like that case would have a reasonable chance.
Well, the way it would unfold is the president would just say the debt limit is unconstitutional, and then he or she would be sued for proceeding in that direction.
So you and I cannot bring suit against the debt ceiling, is what you're telling me.
To my knowledge, no. There would be an act of the executive that would then be sued. He'd get sued by the people who want to burn down the country.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk about that a little bit in just a minute. Let me finish my third point here. The third way we can bypass the debt ceiling, what I call the funny money solution. We can mint $1 trillion platinum coin, make the current debt overrun, disappear immediately. Though there's nothing in the Constitution prohibiting such a move, President Obama rejected this tactic, calling it wacky in a 2017 interview. Current Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen also dismissed the idea in a congressional hearing earlier this year. There are risks in invoking the 14th Amendment or minting that coin. First, as you just anticipated, Mark, it would end up in court, maybe for months or even years, with the right-wing supermajority on the Supreme Court getting the last word. So they're not necessarily the get-out-of-debt ceiling jail-free cards that we might think.
Yeah.
And second, these tactics could be seen by the American public as gimmicks to avoid making serious policy choices about debt, since most Americans, as I said earlier, misunderstand the debt ceiling as a referendum on future spending, when in fact it's about prior spending.
Yeah.
For those reasons, I don't see this game of chicken ending anytime soon.
Yeah.
But how about you?
Well, considering that the American public recently elected Marjorie Taylor Greene to Congress, I feel like gimmicky politics might be right up their alley. If it's questionable whether the debt ceiling is constitutional, I'd like to see it tested. Because worst case, the Supreme Court rules that yes, it is constitutional, and we're right back where we started. So I don't see how that gets us in a worse situation.
Well, here's how it would, though. Let me just jump in there. The president would say this after we've breached the debt limit, or just as we are breaching the debt limit. Then he'd get sued. That would drag on for months. A court would surely stay the president's order pending the resolution of the lawsuit. So we'd be in default until the lawsuit got resolved by the Supreme Court, which could take months or years. So is that really a solution?
No, but that's why you and I, again, should bring suit. This can be mansplaining's legacy to this country, is that we are the ones who bring suit against the debt ceiling and clear this out.
You know what, Mark? You're right. Listeners, we're going on hiatus for 6 months. Mark and I are going to draft the lawsuit to end all lawsuits. Get this thing stricken.
Yeah. We might have to go to law school first, so maybe it's 2 years and 6 months, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, but Trump University is giving law degrees, I hear.
That's true. That's true. You enter your credit card information and you are endowed.
Mm-hmm.
You made me nostalgic for the Gephardt rule, though it occurs to me that the Gephardt rule basically fixed the debt ceiling problem by making it seem even more stupid, that it would just automatically makes you question why there's a debt ceiling in the first place.
Yes.
And so it was a stopgap. It was a very sensible stopgap. I miss it, but the ultimate resolution is, as Gephardt himself pointed out on the floor of the Congress, to make these decisions when you're passing funding measures, not decide months later whether or not you're going to pay for them.
Yes.
That part is just ridiculous. And it's so ridiculous that it amazes me that it was ever passed in the first place. What was our country thinking at the end of World War I?
Well, what we were thinking is we needed a ton of money to fight World War I, the war to end all wars, remember? And we needed to do extraordinary things.
Sure.
But it perhaps should have been repealed right after World War I.
I get that we need money to fight wars. I'm not questioning that. What I'm questioning is this process that they added, where after the fact they would decide whether or not they were actually going to honor that debt. That seems like it's dishonest from its beginning, and I don't really understand the thinking behind it.
Yeah, agreed. So it's a grim answer, but I hope you think I answered this question adequately.
One final question, just in case you came across anything in your reading. So those are dire consequences that you spelled out, like fire and brimstone scenarios. Is there anything that listeners to this podcast can do to maybe shore things up so that they would be a little bit better off to survive such a thing? Or are we all just basically screwed?
There was nothing in my reading I came across, but I couldn't help personalizing this for me, for my family. Would we be able to survive a debt ceiling default? And the answer would be we probably would be able to muddle along for a while, even in a default scenario with our retirement accounts plunging and all, because my wife and I have our family in a pretty good financial posture, We don't run up debt on our credit cards. We're not in debt up to our ears, generally speaking. So the advice, if any, would be to just keep a good fiscal house, and then you can withstand momentary jolts like this. Because you have to believe a debt ceiling default would not last for months. People would understand the seriousness of it within a week or two, and we'd do whatever we needed to do as a country to get out of it. So if your own fiscal house is in order, you can survive that. It's if you're in debt up to your ears and living paycheck to paycheck already, then the debt ceiling default is going to be a disaster for you.
Yeah. So folks, pay off your credit cards. Don't buy a house that you can't afford.
Yeah.
Do not make hope your plan.
Yeah.
We all need hope, but hope is not a plan.
Right.
Well, thank you. You cleared things up and made it a lot more specific, which was what I asked for. And so thank you for that.
Yeah. And now I'm going to ask you a question that I think is part B to what we just discussed. So your question prompted me to dust off a question that's been on my list of potential topics to ask you about for more than a year. Because it's closely related to the question you just asked me, I'm thinking we might consider this to be our first 2-part episode of Mansplaining.
All right.
So your question to me, as we all know, was about what would happen if our government defaulted on its debt service obligations. As we just learned, the recurring debt ceiling drama is underpinned by some politicians' professed concern about out-of-control spending and quickly growing deficits. My question to you for next time is, should we really be worried about that? As one of the sources I consulted for today's episode wrote, quote, "There is no clear economic evidence that current debt levels are dragging on economic growth," end quote. There's also a theory that's been gaining traction among many liberals in Washington in recent years. It's called modern monetary theory, and it basically says that, to quote a write-up about it in the New York Times, quote, "If a government controls its own currency and needs money, it can just print it, as long as its economy has the ability to churn out the needed goods and services," end quote. In other words, deficits don't matter all that much. So, Mark, I'd like you to take a look under the hood of modern monetary theory and tell us whether it makes sense and whether all this talk about the need to tame the deficit and cut spending is really much ado about nothing.
Okay, good question. And you are right. This is a Very appropriate second part to this examination. And in fact, after I'd asked you the previous question and a few days went by, I was kicking myself because I was thinking I should have asked you the question that you just asked me. So this way we get to cover it from both sides. And I look forward to investigating that one.
Good. That's great to hear. And I'm excited for a 2-part episode. These really are thematically so unified. It should be a lot of fun to have you come back at me after I answered part A. You get part B.
Right. And our listeners will be so excited between this episode and the next one. Like, where is this going to go? Bated breath.
Yeah.
It's like waiting for Dune Part 2 in the theaters.
We might have to release a 30-second trailer to stanch the excitement.
Exactly. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us. If you would like to follow up on some of the sources that Joe read or leave a comment or a question about this episode, you can best do that on our Facebook page, where you will find us at Mansplaining the Podcast. Again, you can say anything you want there. You can ask a question. You can pose a possible future episode. If you do have a question for a future episode and Facebook is not your style, there's another way for you to ask it of us, which is we now have a phone number where you can leave us a voicemail. And that number is 206-486-4074. You can call, you can ask your question, and if we find it to be inspiring, it will become a future episode. Though please, no telemarketing calls. We are already doing as well as we can with car insurance. I don't know about you, Joe, but I think we're set for car insurance.
Yeah, and to the lady who keeps asking Mark for a date, stop. He's married.
Yes, yeah. Not dead, married, but also not dating. If you would like to help other people discover this podcast, the easiest and best way for you to do that, aside from shouting the name Mansplaining from the window of your apartment or home, is to go to your podcast platform of choice. That could be iTunes, it could be Spotify, it could be Google Play. Wherever you're listening to this, go in and find our podcast and leave us a rating or a review. 5 stars make us feel really good. Saying something nice about what you enjoy about the podcast helps other people understand what they would like about the podcast, and it brings in more audience members. And we do like to see our audience figures tick up a little bit. But that's it for this week. Thank you for spending some time with us. My name's Mark. That was Joe, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.